I'd like to welcome you to the 2022 Vermont Organics Recycling Summit, organized by the Composting Association of Vermont in partnership with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, Department of Environmental Conservation. This year's summit is being held during the International Compost Awareness Week, which is the largest and most comprehensive education initiative of the composting industry. And the theme this year is Recipe for Regeneration, Compost. I'm Natasha Duarte, the director of the Composting Association of Vermont. I'd like to just start by sending out huge thanks to our sponsors. These include Community Bank, Eco Products, Vegware, Vermont Natural Ag Products, Addison County Solid Waste Management District, AgriLab Technologies, Compost Manufacturing Alliance, EcoPixel, Nature Cycle, the Vermont Produce Program from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, and Wasted. Before we get into today's program, I'd just like to take a second to promote our online auction, which has become our annual fundraising event for the Composting Association of Vermont. And we've expanded it this year to include everything from Kiss the Ground regenerative gift bundle to bulk compost to a family pass at Jay Peak Water Park and chocolates and a lot more. The auction is online now and will be open through Sunday, May 8th. And everything was generously donated. So 100% of the funds raised goes to support CAV. So take a look there when you can. And there should be a link to this on the Composting Association of Vermont's website. And it will also be in the daily VORS reminders. So here's the program of events today. We're going to be starting off with the State of Organics presentation in just a few minutes. And then our keynote starting at 1:30 is from Finian Makepeace from Kiss the Ground. And then just a reminder that we also have a 3 p.m. session today, the Compost Carbon Connection and Carbon Offsets through Soil Regeneration. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite Josh Kelly to share his screen while I introduce him. Josh is going to be giving opening remarks in the State of Organics presentation. He's the Solid Waste Program Manager at the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation.
Well, thank you so much. And first, thanks, I would say, as always, and it's almost been as always. We only have one time when it wasn't CAV hosting this event for ANRTEC. So thank you, and very special thanks to Natasha. It's always great to share the stage with her. And it's great to be here again. I can't believe it's the 16th year of VORS. My name is Josh Kelly. I've recently, as of this past January, taken over as the Solid Waste Program Manager for Kathy Jameson, which are definitely, I'm finding, big shoes to fill. But it's really been exciting and daunting all at once to be in this role. And it's been some changes here at DEC. We had Chuck Schwer retire, and then Kathy Jameson not long after. And Matt Chapman stepped into Chuck Schwer's role. And then I stepped into Kathy's. So there's been some changes. And then my apologies for us not having someone from the Secretary or Commissioner's office here today. We recently had a change with Commissioner Peter Walk, who had been at the agency for at least 4 years, if not longer. COVID always adding 2 to everything. He's taken another job with Efficiency Vermont. So in that transition, I just didn't have the time to get this onto Commissioner John Beeling's schedule. But he's our acting commissioner of DEC, and he's a definite advocate of your work, and he's an absolute supporter of the solid waste initiatives we have in the state. So as I said, I'm the solid waste program manager now, and formerly the materials management section chief. Been working on the universal recycling law for most of its time. It started passed in 2012, and I started just after in 2013. But let's get right into some of the data and trends of this past year. First, I guess I want to use a state motto here of freedom and unity. I was trying to think of my own sort of theme for VORS this year. And I guess from my perspective, freedom and unity has its sort of struggles with balancing those two things, staying connected and unified and also free at the same time. And so to me, the state motto is a good way to reflect where we are I guess in this path that we've been on, and many of you have been on for decades. But so anyway, that's sort of a nice theme for me to reflect on for this year. Let's start with where things are at across the country. I find it very fascinating to see how many states have now passed some type of food waste ban, and the number has grown to 9 since we last were together, or at least remotely together. Washington State is the newest one that I'm aware of to pass some type of organics or food waste related policy measure at the state level. And I'd encourage you to check that one out. It's fairly holistic. In that law, it talks about the use of compost, and this is not a surprise to anyone here who's listening, but essentially, as I described to folks entering this field or practitioners of food waste and organics recovery, you need someone who's willing to take their waste material and do something with it. You need someone to haul it. You need someone to process it. And then you need a market for that material. And that's really the 4, I guess, legs of the stool, if you will. Somebody I know used to work in this field, you use that analogy, and I'll use it again. And Washington State has a pretty interesting bill. So it's worth checking out if you have the time. This is a slide, a pie chart we have shown before. And the reason I'm showing it again is because we don't have updated data yet. Every 5 years, approximately, we do a waste composition study. And this is the last one was done in 2018. The next waste composition study is scheduled to be completed in 2023. So when I'm asked continuously about the results of the food waste ban and how is it going, we have limited data. So we've some of our best data actually comes out of the waste composition study. So this is just good base level knowledge for anyone watching this presentation. Just like the rest of the country, Vermont had found that about 20% of the waste stream is food and food waste or food scraps. And the estimate of the tonnage of that is approximately 77,000, or rounded off to roughly 80 tons per year. The US EPA finds that about 20% of the US waste stream is food and food waste. And by material type, it's the single largest portion of the waste stream by type. You'll note special waste here, but that's actually a category made up of a bunch of different materials, from rubber, textiles, bulky goods like couches, mattresses, things like that. It's just a lumped category in the way we had our data. But certainly food waste is, by material type, the largest portion of the waste stream, and roughly half of it is residential, according to our data for where that material is coming from. Roughly half is residential, and the other half is commercial, industrial, institutional waste. When we have put that tonnage factor into the EPA's WARM model to evaluate what the emissions offsets were if it were to be composted, it is so staggeringly significant. It's more than 9,000 vehicles taken off the road each year if we were to take action and keep that stuff out of the waste stream. And for that reason, Vermont, as well as many other states, are continuously focusing on the recycling of organics. And that includes everything from preventing food waste at the beginning, keeping perfectly edible food into feeding people, and people in need particularly, so food rescue and food donation, feeding animals, composting, and anaerobic digestion. So stay tuned. The next waste composition study is in 2023. I'm very interested to find out what it tells us, and keep up the good work with all of your stakeholders, constituents, customers, to keep them separating material, because we're going to need their work to see if we're making progress. So this is a slide I haven't shown in previous fours. This is from our annual Diversion and Disposal report. This is from the 2020, the most recently completed Diversion and Disposal report. And I think the stacked bar really shows the trends over time. So what you can see here are the amount of waste that is overall generated. That's the entire bar chart line, and which portion of it is recycled or composted, and what portion is disposed of. So the red is disposed, the blue is recycled, composted, reused. The reason 1987 is on here, we didn't have great data. The data has improved in terms of our monitoring since the late 90s. So there's kind of a gap at the beginning of this slide or this chart. But as you can see, there was an increase overall in disposal. As we were heading, since the law was first passed in 2012, and especially around since 2014, there was a slow decline in waste and a slight increase in the amount of materials recycled. And that included some increase in the food that was recycled as well. But note 2020, in general, there was a drop in disposal, primarily due to the pandemic. But also note that the blue bar didn't really drop that much. And so disposal in general and waste generation dropped, but recycling, composting remained fairly steady. And you can actually see that in this next slide. So this is again from the annual Diversion and Disposal report. This is from data reported to us from facilities. So when food waste and rescued food comes through Vermont facilities, at least with the solid waste facilities, they're required to report to us if they're certified solid waste facilities. The food donation is voluntarily provided to us by the Vermont Food Bank, and we're lucky to have a statewide organization to be able to provide that data. So here I just want to point out some of the trends from 2020. I mentioned that in general, waste generation fell a bit, and so you can see that organics, that's the part of this that is most of that is food waste. There is some leaf and yard debris in that organics factor. It fell a little bit in 2022 as well, but food rescue has been pretty stable and pretty constant over the past 5 years. And I think, but for the pandemic, when a lot of restaurants, schools, and other things shuttered, we would have still been seeing climbs, except for the big drop in our economy. So those are some of the trends from this past year, and this is the aggregate data. So the blue line, again, it's just a different way of looking at the data. The blue line is generation of waste altogether. The red is the amount that's disposed, and the green is the amount recycled or composted. And so you see our goal has been for decades a 50% diversion rate, and we also call it in shorthand sort of the recycling rate, all the things we want to reuse, recycle, compost. And it's been our desire to have 50% of our waste be recycled and 50% be disposed. But where we've been is around 33 to 36%. We seem to hover there pretty consistently. So I think what you can see again here in these trends is the stability of the green line that has been pretty steady over the years since the universal recycling law was phased in. And disposal has kind of fluctuated a bit, partly with the growing economic activity. It tends to track well with that. And the years from 2017 to 2018 were certainly higher in, and even into 19 in economic activity. And then, of course, the pandemic having an impact on that in 2020. So we remain as a state focused on this goal, but we are also trying to focus on waste reduction as well. We have a 10% waste reduction goal in addition to this in our materials management plan. That materials management plan currently ends in 2024, and we will be putting in place a new one for essentially 2025. Setting either new goals or new targets with public input from all of you. All right, so this is a slide I shared last year, but some small things have changed. Many of these facilities with the red arrows are new, and they were either sited or permitted at or around 2020 or 2021. So up in the top, Northeast Kingdom, you have Marjo Acres Compost Facility. That's an on-farm composter up in it's near Coventry. I think it's technically in Irisburg. And then in the Williston area, you have Casella's depackager that was put in place at the all-cycle transfer station. And then going south over in the Salisbury area is the Vanguard Renewables digester at the Goodrich Farm. In the middle of the state in Rochester is Music Mountain composting facility. That's Zach Kavakis. And then over near Heartland and White River Junction is Sunrise Farm, Chuck Wooster's composting facility there. So there's been some activity. Some of these facilities are newer than others. And there's also been a lot of upgrades at existing facilities in response to some of the amount of materials that are being now separated, which is just really excellent to see. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the haulers, who have more than tripled now since the law was first passed in 2012. So there's a lot more people out there doing this work, and it's desperately needed. So thank you for that. I just wanted to remind folks, especially anyone new to the Vermont Organics Recycling Summit, about DEC's rules. DEC has solid waste oversight of certain activities, including composting, but there have been some changes to state law. And so I put a note at the bottom to see the Agency of Agriculture's Food and Markets presentation later on this week in the VORS lineup of workshops. There's one on Thursday afternoon that would be worth probably tuning into, because DEC and Agency of Ag have a shared oversight responsibility where on-farm composting and composting with chickens is under certain jurisdictions under Agency of Ag. In short, if it's 2,000 over 2,000 cubic yards, we have jurisdiction over that, but those below that are on farm, Agency of Ag has jurisdiction over. So briefly to run through these bullets, if you compost 42 cubic yards per year of food scraps or less, that's an exempt activity. And if you only thinking about how you measure it, if you're measuring currently in tons or in pounds, the conversion we're using for food scraps is roughly 2 cubic yards equals about a ton of food waste or food scraps. Employees in the new solid waste rules, these are our 2020 rules that passed and were approved in 2020. Employees can add food scraps to their employer's food scrap bin if the employer allows it, so that doesn't require a permit either. And then food scrap drop-off has become an easier practice. It just requires a one-time registration and annual reporting. So it can be pretty turnkey in terms of working with DEC. All right, so that's just a brief recap of our solid waste rules. In the legislature this year, Act H501, which has not passed as an act yet, but it is an act relating to the regulation of depackaging. There's been quite a bit of concerns raised about the potential for microplastics and PFAS from packaging that food is in to make its way into soils through depackaging facilities or otherwise. And so the bill would place a moratorium on new depackaging facility certifications in Vermont. It would require the Agency of Natural Resources to convene stakeholders to make recommendations on, I would just say, a host of food waste recycling or food waste recycling system attributes, from the food recovery hierarchy to source separation to proper use of depackagers, so that there's this directive that stakeholders be engaged and talked to, and then come back to the legislature with a report on recommendations on these topics. So stay tuned for that. My understanding is that this bill is still moving. I don't know exactly where it is in the process, but it's still active, maybe attached to another bill. Excuse me. The study, it also includes a study on microplastics and PFAS in food waste. So it requires us to study that. We are planning some studies on that anyway, and actually have applied to the EPA for some grant funding as part of their pollution prevention program to cover some of the costs that it can be very, very expensive to test for both microplastics and PFAS. And in the case of microplastics, there's not like one universal testing mechanism for that. Lastly, it requires ANR to adopt rules for depackaging facility operation in Vermont. I will note we already have rules for that, but it's more sort of saying after you do these things, then adopt rules. So I would just summarize and say it's a bill heavily aimed at depackaging, but what we are understanding is that there's not only one pathway for concerning materials like microplastics or PFAS to make it into soil. And furthermore, it's a concern in the food system in general. Just for a note for people listening in, the Vermont Department of Health has a requirement in July of 2023 to enact a ban on PFAS in food packaging. And that was passed in the previous legislative session. So that law is on the books and goes into effect again in the summer of 2020, which should essentially be eliminating PFAS in food packaging. Many companies have already made agreements to do that voluntarily. I guess I just wanted to, since we're talking about this topic and essentially it's emerging contaminants, I wanted to bring our awareness to what other emerging contaminants have we as practitioners talked about over the years. Pathogens and pathogen kill has been discussed in compost and digestates. Heavy metals contaminant has been the common ones that were originally looked at the beginning of a lot of these waste management operations. And then PAHs, which are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. They come from the burning of fossil fuels and cars, and the exhaust from trucks and cars going up and making it into the body of the leaf. And when a leaf is then composted, especially city leaves, these PAHs can remain. Generally, it was not as much of an issue in Vermont because we're so rural, but in urban areas, they actually can cause issues. Persistent herbicides were the most recent one to cause a lot of consternation for composters. And so a lot of the composting community has found ways to address that. And PFAS and microplastics are really just the next. And they could pose potential impacts to compost and digestate. And they are proving very costly, especially in the case of microplastics, to test for. So standards to require testing could be very costly for those in the industry. So we're still looking at that, as is the legislature. A couple of studies, if people want to learn more about these topics, there's an EPA report and there's multiple EPA reports, two of them, on emerging contaminants and plastics in food waste streams, and a UVM study that is just wrapping up now. And so a couple of quotes, though, that I think are just interesting to this research. You know, the EPA says much remains unknown about the fate of PFAS and plastics during composting and anaerobic digestion. And when applied to land, making it challenging to evaluate the risk to human health and the environment. So we're wading into this, and as I said, DEC is hoping that we get some funds through the EPA's pollution prevention program to explore packaging and to explore the results of any organics recycling system to contribute microplastics or PFAS to the ultimate soil. And how much is that happening and how much is that a risk? And then the UVM study, this is really pioneered by Dr. Roy and his team of students and grad students. He's just mentioning in the white paper they created, summarizing their work, that it's critical for legislation to bolster monitoring and research on microplastics to enable design of data-driven and risk-based regulatory standards that protect Vermont soils and enhance the sustainability of organics recycling. So I think we're going to be hearing more on this in the future. I just wanted to raise it because it's been talked about a lot in the past several months. What is DEC up to? We are once again looking at our Scrap Food Waste campaign to promote the activities of many of you out there and your constituents, your businesses and institutions that are composting and recycling organics in a multitude of ways. This one is really about reducing contaminants. We're talking about contaminants of concern. We know that if we can keep the plastic bags to a minimum, it helps everybody. And so we're looking at kind of a very similar campaign to what we did with recycling in 2015 and 16. We launched the Recycle Like You Live Here campaign in partnership with Chittenden Solid Waste District and with some support from some invested time from Casella. And that was really about bringing the message home that, recycling, it has value when you keep it clean. And this is a similar thing. So we don't have a name for this yet. We are just starting the process of looking at our media contacts to see if we can hire somebody to do some work for us and continue this messaging, this sort of branding we've created. I've been calling it Cleaner Compost for the moment, but we'll be having more information on this to come. And so this is my moment to really just thank you, for doing this work, even when it's hard. For doing this work, even when it's messy, and it gets really messy sometimes. And for doing this work, even when it feels like it doesn't matter. It really does matter. And when I'm out meeting with other states, I'm continually impressed by how much people want to achieve what we have achieved, how much they are striving for better management systems to get food waste and food rescued and out of the waste stream. So your work really does matter, and I thank you. And I'm probably just at time, and that's my end slide, Natasha. So I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Josh, for that presentation. We really appreciate it. And we probably have time for one quick question if anyone has it. Otherwise, we will be switching over to our keynote. And I'm sure Josh, he's provided his contact information there, and as always has had an open door policy for folks who have questions or want to learn more. Josh and his staff have been excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Josh.